Everyone at the table laughed when the powerful Chinese investor made a cruel remark about the waiter, until the waiter quietly answered back in flawless Mandarin. "Watch how clumsy he is with those chopsticks," she said to her guests in Chinese, waving a dismissive hand toward the man pouring wine. "Someone like that should be cleaning floors, not serving people like us." The businessmen seated with her forced awkward chuckles. They didn't understand the language, but they knew she controlled a $60 billion empire and wanted to stay in her good graces. David Thompson kept his expression calm, as if he hadn't heard a word. For 8 months he'd worked as a waiter at Manhattan's exclusive Jade Palace, enduring insults with quiet discipline. But tonight, there was a different fire behind his eyes, one born of someone who had already survived bigger storms. The investor, Li Wei, was famous for her arrogance even among the world's richest. She treated Americans as naive and anyone with darker skin as beneath her notice. What she didn't know was that the quiet waiter she mocked held a Harvard master's degree in Asian studies, spoke Mandarin as smoothly as a native, and had once been Dr. David Thompson, one of America's leading experts on U.S.-China relations. Just 9 months earlier, David had been negotiating multi-billion-dollar trade deals and dining with ambassadors. A jealous colleague at the State Department planted false evidence, accusing him of leaking information. Though cleared completely, the investigation ruined his career. No university or think tank would hire someone the FBI had once investigated. Now, serving wine in silence, David listened as Li Wei continued her taunts, switching between Mandarin and English, pretending he couldn't understand. The businessmen shifted uncomfortably. They sensed the cruelty, even if they didn't grasp every word. But David was no longer angry. He was calculating. He knew something Li Wei would soon discover. Underestimating someone because of their appearance can be the most expensive mistake a person ever makes. If you're drawn to stories where quiet dignity turns the tables on arrogance, be sure to subscribe and follow this journey, because this night of humiliation was about to become the costliest lesson of Li Wei's career. 7 months of public humiliation. 7 months of sensational headlines and so-called friends turning their backs. When the investigation finally proved the accusations false, every piece of evidence exposed as a forgery, it was too late. No one in the diplomatic world wanted to hire a man once suspected of espionage, no matter how thoroughly cleared. Marcus Sterling stepped into the promotion that should have been David's. "Bring the bill," Li Wei said in deliberately broken English, as if speaking correctly would be beneath her. "And tell that waiter I'm Li Wei from Wei Industries. Perhaps he's seen my family on television." David nearly dropped his pen. Li Wei of Wei Industries, the same powerful executive with whom he'd exchanged formal emails for 3 years while coordinating high-level trade visits, the same person who had once publicly praised him as the American who truly understands our culture. Of course she didn't recognize him now. Back then he wore $1,000 suits and mingled in her circles. Tonight he wore a plain black server's uniform, someone she could treat as invisible. Switching to Mandarin so her American guests couldn't follow, she launched into a lecture about natural hierarchies, insisting that some people were simply destined to be beneath others. She gestured toward David as if he were a prop in her argument. Robert Hayes, the American CEO hosting the dinner, shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should focus on the contract details," he suggested. But Li Wei waved a jeweled hand. "No, let me finish. You must understand who you're dealing with when you do business with us." David continued serving, his expression neutral, cataloging every word. She had no idea she was undermining herself with every arrogant sentence. Then she called him closer. "You," she said in English, pointing as if giving a command. "What's your name?" "David, ma'am?" "David," she repeated, tasting the name like something sour. "Have you ever heard of China? Do you even know where it is on the map?" The American businessmen were frozen, realizing this had gone far beyond acceptable behavior. "Yes, ma'am," David replied calmly. She laughed. turning back to the table in Mandarin. How cute, he knows where China is. For the first time all night, David met her eyes. The look wasn't submissive or fearful. It was something far more dangerous: recognition. Every slight only strengthened the quiet resolve forming inside him, a cold determination forged in silence. Li Wei couldn't see that with each insult, she was writing her own downfall. During the pause between dinner and dessert, while she continued her cutting remarks for the guests' amusement, David walked to the staff restroom. His outward composure masked a storm. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message that would change everything. James, I need an urgent favor. I'm at the Jade Palace in Manhattan and witnessing something the Chinese diplomatic community should know about. Li Wei of Wei Industries is here making extreme, offensive comments in Mandarin, assuming no one understands. I have it all recorded. Can we meet tomorrow? The reply from Dr. James Chun, his former mentor and now the director of Columbia's Center for Asian Studies, arrived in less than 2 minutes. My goodness, David, where have you been hiding all this time? Yes, let's meet, Dr. Chun replied almost instantly. Li Wei is already under investigation in China for corruption and unethical behavior abroad. Her comments could be exactly what we need. For the first time in months, David allowed himself a small smile. Dr. Chun had no idea he was working as a waiter. In the message David had sent, he identified himself only as a witness. To his mentor, he was still the brilliant diplomat from their days at Columbia. When David returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted. Li Wei had raised her performance to a level that made even seasoned international businessmen glance at one another in discomfort. She was now mocking accents in deliberately broken English, speaking to David as if addressing a child. You know how to clear a table, yes? She said with a sing-song tone. Or can you only carry plates? The businessmen went silent. Even in the ruthless world of global deals, this crossed a line, but none of them dared challenge a woman who controlled multi-billion-dollar contracts. I can clear the table just fine, ma'am, David answered evenly, his calm a striking contrast to her taunts. How adorable, she laughed. He speaks properly after all. Maybe he's not as simple as he looks. Turning to the group, she added in Mandarin, See? When you speak firmly, they learn. Then she made the mistake that would cost her everything. Pulling out her phone, she began recording a video in Mandarin. Here I am at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, showing how Americans train their staff. Watch how quiet he stays when I speak with authority. David continued clearing dishes, noting every word, every second of self-incrimination. Li Wei was documenting her own downfall. She kept talking into the camera, weaving claims of cultural superiority and crude theories about natural hierarchies, remarks that made the remaining guests visibly uneasy. Robert Hayes, the American host, finally stood. Excuse me, I need to make a call, he said abruptly, and walked out, followed by 2 other businessmen. Li Wei misread their departure as agreement. Do you see how it works? She told her phone. When you establish order, even Americans understand. This waiter is the perfect example. He knows his place. David stood quietly at the side, outwardly respectful, but with a new intensity in his eyes. She was too absorbed in her performance to notice. For 20 more minutes, she continued, providing a complete catalog of discriminatory statements and arrogant boasts, each one a potential headline. David calmly documented it all, even recording her recording, capturing her words and expressions for evidence. She ended her video with a flourish. Tomorrow I'll share this online. My followers will love seeing how America lets anyone work in places like this. David's slight smile returned. On that point, she was correct. Someone would indeed be very interested in those videos, but it wouldn't be her followers. As Li Wei slipped her phone back into her purse, pleased with her own performance, David continued serving with the patience of a man who knows that real justice is prepared slowly, like a dish that must simmer before it's served. She had no idea that every cutting remark she'd made was already turning into evidence for a reckoning she could not imagine. Li Wei lifted her third glass of champagne and decided to give her evening a grand finale. The remaining American executives shifted uncomfortably, but she mistook their unease for admiration. "You know what?" she said in Mandarin, fixing her gaze on David. "I think it's time for a lesson in hierarchy." Switching to halting English, she added with a mocking smile, "You show me a dance. A funny show?" That was the moment David Thompson made his choice. He set the tray down, straightened, and for the first time that evening, smiled. A calm, unshakable smile that made Robert Hayes nearly choke on his wine. "Madam Li Wei," David said in flawless Mandarin, his pronunciation refined and precise, "I believe you're confusing this restaurant with a circus." A heavy silence fell over the room. Li Wei froze, the color draining from her face. The words, delivered in elegant Mandarin, hit like a thunderclap. What did you say?" she whispered in English. David continued in classical Mandarin, each syllable deliberate. "It is remarkable how some people mistake wealth for wisdom, birth for character, and status for true worth." The American businessman stared, stunned. Robert Hayes, accustomed to working with professional interpreters, instantly recognized the mastery in David's speech. You speak Chinese?" Li Wei managed, her voice barely audible. "Classical Mandarin, modern Mandarin, Cantonese, and 3 regional dialects," David replied evenly, "along with English, French, and some Japanese. But I suspect you already realize that, after the 90 minutes of conversation, you believed I couldn't understand." The realization struck her like a physical blow. 90 minutes, every insult, every condescending phrase, he had understood it all. "That's impossible," she stammered, trying to regain control. "You're just a waiter." "I am a waiter," David said, his tone calm but unyielding. "But I am also Dr. David Thompson, Harvard PhD in Asian Studies, specialist in Sino-American relations and Chinese business culture." He let the words settle. "I spent 5 years as a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, coordinated trade delegations, and published 17 scholarly articles on Chinese diplomacy." Robert Hayes pushed back his chair, astonished. "My goodness, you're David Thompson. I read your work on Chinese investment in American infrastructure. You disappeared from the diplomatic world a year ago." Li Wei's world tilted. "But why are you here?" "Because sometimes life teaches humility," David answered. "I was falsely accused of espionage. By the time I was cleared, the doors to diplomacy had already closed. So I took this job to survive, and for 8 months, people like you have spoken freely in Mandarin, certain I couldn't understand." He drew his phone from his pocket. "Every remark, every display of prejudice, every lecture about supposed superiority, I recorded them all, including the video you just made of yourself." Li Wei's face turned ashen. You wouldn't dare." David's quiet smile was answer enough. "I already have." Every second, every word. Li Wei's humiliation was complete. But David wasn't finished. "Ms. Li Wei," he said evenly, "I believe we've met before in a more formal setting. I coordinated 3 U.S.-China investment conferences where your company participated. We even shared 2 video conferences in 2022. Of course, back then I was in a tailored suit, speaking as an equal with ambassadors. It's understandable you didn't recognize me tonight." She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Not only had she been exposed, she was realizing that the man she'd belittled all evening had once negotiated agreements that directly affected her own empire. "You once claimed people like me don't understand international politics," David continued, his tone steady but commanding. "Yet I spent 3 years brokering trade deals between our countries, including contracts that benefited Wei Industries." The American executives finally understood. They had just watched one of the world's foremost experts on Chinese culture endure hours of quiet abuse. "You've also shared some controversial ideas about intelligence and status," David added. I wonder what officials in Beijing would think of a Chinese business leader making statements like those on American soil. Li Wei found her voice at last. You can't. This would ruin everything. My reputation, my contracts. I imagine so, David said calmly, especially since your government is strict about citizens who create diplomatic problems abroad. Robert Hayes, still stunned, muttered, Li Wei, you humiliated one of America's leading authorities on your own culture. David took out his phone and held up the screen. I've already sent the recordings to Dr. James Chun, director of Columbia's Center for Asian Studies. He's very interested. The message from Dr. Chun glowed on the display. David, this is significant. The Chinese consulate must see it immediately. I also forwarded it to the Chinese Business Association in the U.S., David added. Their code of ethics is strict. Cold sweat formed on Li Wei's forehead. International contracts worth billions hung by a thread, and Beijing had little patience for public embarrassment. Please, she whispered, her former bravado gone. David's voice stayed gentle but unyielding. Would your behavior have been acceptable if I were only a waiter? Does a person's dignity depend on a degree or a bank balance? The restaurant manager stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, he said with new respect, I didn't know your background. Our policy will change immediately. Thank you, David replied, but this isn't about me. It's about how we treat people when we think no one is watching. Li Wei tried one final angle. Dr. Thompson, perhaps we can reach an understanding. An understanding? David gave a sad smile. For 8 months, people like you spoke freely, believing I was just another invisible worker. Every remark was documented. The only thing I want is for you to leave knowing that arrogance always has a price. Li Wei rose on unsteady legs, panic replacing pride. She knew the recordings would reach the highest levels in both countries. Her career would never recover. David remained composed, proof that real strength comes from character, not status. As she walked out of the Jade Palace, one question lingered. Could someone so consumed by prejudice truly change, or must life itself deliver the lesson? 3 months later, the answer appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Billionaire Li Wei loses $800 million in contracts after viral video scandal. The Chinese consulate quickly released an official statement condemning Li Wei's remarks, and within 2 weeks, Wei Industries had lost nearly 70% of its U.S. contracts. During a tense video conference, her uncle delivered the final blow. The family has decided you need time to reflect. Your executive privileges are suspended indefinitely. The woman who had arrived in New York as a queen returned home a corporate outcast. Meanwhile, David Thompson became an international symbol of quiet strength. The video of that unforgettable night spread across the globe, over 50 million views in days, turning him into a living example of dignity in the face of prejudice. Universities in 3 countries invited him to lecture. The U.S. State Department offered him his former position back, this time with a promotion and a 60% raise. It was never about revenge, David told CNN. It was about proving that human dignity is priceless and that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. He accepted the diplomatic post, but chose to keep 1 day a week at the Jade Palace, now as a senior advisor and minority partner. The restaurant quickly became a destination for human rights advocates, a place where a simple act of respect had reshaped a global conversation. Inspired by his story, organizations introduced the David Thompson Protocol, a zero-tolerance standard for discrimination in commercial spaces. Li Wei issued a public apology in halting English, but the internet was unforgiving. Not unfortunate, racist, read one comment that captured the mood. She's only sorry because she was caught. 6 months later, at a major conference on corporate diversity, David met Robert Hayes, one of the businessmen who had witnessed everything. Hayes shook his hand warmly. David, you taught us the greatest business lesson there is: never underestimate anyone. Li Wei, meanwhile, lived in quiet seclusion in Shanghai. Former friends avoided her, contracts evaporated, and her once towering reputation never recovered. the most expensive lesson a billionaire could pay, because money can't buy dignity, and prejudice always collects its debt. If this story of courage and justice resonated with you, subscribe and share how you would react if you witnessed something like this. Together we can spread a simple truth. Respect is not a privilege, it is a basic human right.